Boots, back to Ogo. We'll start with Professor Clark with a 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll go over to you, Mr. Boots. But the floor is yours, Ms. Clark. Welcome back. We're very pleased to have you back helping us. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be back speaking with the committee. So in 2022, our research team based at Carleton University, and including both myself and Mr. Boots, launched govcanadacontracts.ca, which is an open access research tool to help people more easily explore the Government of Canada's proactively disclosed data on federal contracting. So that tool provides data on all federal contracts between 2017 and 2022. But our focus in the research paper and in the testimony that we'll give today is focusing just on the IT contracting piece specifically. So I should note that the paper we're presenting and the findings are still under peer review, but we did want to release it while that process is underway, given the urgency of the topic. Knowing that effective IT procurement is key not just to the success of individual digital projects, but also essential to effective modern public administration more broadly, our goal with the research was to better diagnose the extent to which the Government of Canada adheres to widely accepted best practice in IT procurement. We suspected, given previous research and a fairly thick body of anecdotal evidence, that the federal government wasn't following the rules for good IT procurement, but we wanted to test that assumption with stronger data. So to do so, we turned to the Proactive Disclosure of Contracts dataset, which is published by the Government of Canada. A fair amount of work went into cleaning those data, and if you're interested in that, we outline how we did that on our website and also in the paper that we're presenting. So, with that data in hand, cleaned, ready to go, to evaluate it, we created a framework looking at international experience to outline a set of sort of rules for modern public sector IT contracting, and then we assessed the extent to which the Government of Canada follows those rules. So what did we find? The main punchline is that the federal government breaks almost all globally accepted best practice for modern public sector IT procurement. And I'll give a high-level summary here. First, federal IT contracts are generally too big, both in terms of length and dollar value, to succeed. And that conclusion rests on a strong body of evidence showing that for software projects in particular, contracts need to be small to allow the project to adjust based on regular and early user feedback, to avoid pooling risk and dependencies in a small number of large contracts, to make it easy to dispense with vendors that are underperforming, and to open up competition to a broad range of vendors, not just those capable of bidding for and winning large contracts. So despite all the evidence that smaller contracts are far more likely to lead to project success, we find that the majority, 53% of IT spending in the Government of Canada, is allocated to contracts that break the threshold dollar value for likely project success. So that's the first big finding. The second big finding looks at the sort of diversity of the number of vendors winning government contracts, because we know that, like basic economics, the more competitive and kind of pluralistic the market, and the more likely you are to have success in kind of buying. So we looked at the supplier market. We identify a small number of prominent IT vendors, where 3 vendors received over $100 million in contracts annually and make up 23% of government IT contract spending. This is alongside a really long tail of thousands of smaller IT vendors and contractors. We note in the paper that one of the things we can't identify with the data we have is how many of those are those pass-through vendors that you've been looking at in something like the ArriveCAN study. Third, we looked to the importance of building in-house IT expertise, which is something the committee has heard several times. And the reasons that you want to build that in-house IT expertise are so that you can be a smart shopper, you can build in-house when it makes more sense to do so, and that you can kind of hold those contractors to account. We looked at the contractor to in-house staff ratios in this part of the analysis, and we found that the Government of Canada has, in some departments, the number of contracted IT workers greatly outnumber in-house IT staff. There's nuance to explore in what that right ratio is, and I hope we can get into that in our discussions. The fourth finding, and again, breaching global best practice, and in a frankly shocking betrayal of responsible stewardship of public funds, current government policies favor vendor ownership of intellectual property and data, and do not prioritize adoption of open source solutions. And this is despite strong evidence showing that open source generates more cost-effective, secure, publicly accountable, and higher quality digital services. So these policies on IP represent a clear recipe for ongoing lock-in to vendors who produce custom software for government, reduce departments' ability to share and reuse software, and likely result in frequent cases where the government of Canada is paying for the same or comparable software multiple times over. So we conclude the paper with a series of policy recommendations, which are also detailed in a brief that we presented to the committee on an earlier occasion. We also note several limitations to our analysis, which we'd like to really get into today as well, resulting in large part from the limited data we have. For us, this is a really an area that is ripe for immediate attention because, as the committee will know all too well, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of IT contracting patterns in Canada. So this research is one attempt to do that, and we really look forward to discussing our research process, the findings, and their implications with the committee.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. I hope when the paper is published, we'll be able to have the two of you back to discuss it in length. Mr. Boots, please, the floor is yours. Go ahead, sir.
Cool. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of you for having me here. I think it's been about a year and a half since last time Professor Clark and I were here, and it's really kind of you to all invite us back to talk about the research. Like Professor Clark said, I think it dovetails well with the number of the studies that this committee has undertaken, the ArriveCAN study, the McKinsey study, this study on the outsourcing of contracts. And there are themes like the de-skilling of public sector workers, especially IT staff, and the government's dependency on outsourcing and consultants that all kind of connect as like a thread throughout each of these studies, and I'm glad you're doing the work to examine this. Professor Clark and I have spoken here before. She's given a great overview of our research in her opening remarks. All the number crunching, if you want to go back and look at it, is on the govcanadacontracts.ca website, along with a guide to reforming IT procurement that we spoke about on the previous occasion we were here. And the research paper that's just gone in for peer review, that's sort of the final stage of this research, and you can read the preprint version on Professor Clark's website, and yeah, we'll definitely get the final version over your way once it's published. And if the preprint version, if it seems dense, which is classic academia, I'd say skip to the charts. They're pretty eye-opening. On page 24 of the paper, you'll see who the biggest players are in the federal government IT space. And on page 27, setting aside things like software licensing and computer devices and telephones, you'll see the big names, specifically in IT consulting services year by year, which is, I think, of particular interest. And I think the main takeaway is that situations like ArriveCAN aren't an isolated case. What we're looking at are systemic issues in how the federal public service conducts IT procurement work. And looking at the research landscape and at other jurisdictions, it's clear just how much Canada has fallen behind our peers. The policy recommendations that we put forward at the end of the paper, they aren't that earth-shattering. They're basically best practices that other governments around the world have been doing for years. And the question is, why haven't we made any progress on them in the Canadian federal government? There have been some kind of like baby steps over the past year or two. This committee's work probably helped move some of those forward. There's updated guidance on procurement that isn't bad, but it's very timid. And there's new, attestation requirements for business owners and Treasury Board policy. Those take effect in September. But ultimately, the interventions that we've seen from the federal government over the past year, including this latest edition from September, they amount to basically follow the rules harder. And there's a great piece from Paul Craig, who's another government technologist, on his website, Federal Field Notes, that talks about why this isn't good enough. Here's what we haven't seen: fundamental changes in process, regulatory or legislative changes around procurement, or efforts to make procurement simpler and easier for small companies to be part of. Follow the rules harder isn't a viable strategy when part of the problem is that there are too many rules. And this creates a lopsided environment where the only companies that can win government contracts are ones like GC Strategies, but also like really large consulting firms that specialize in navigating complicated procurement processes and in building relationships with public sector IT executives. That's what they're good at, and that's why they win contracts. They don't win because they're good at building technology products, which is partly why we often have so many IT failures. And then on the other hand, from the public service side, if you're a senior IT manager or a senior public service leader, going to go work for a large consulting firm or IT vendor is a frequent post-retirement career strategy. That's something we've heard anecdotally quite a bit, which means that no one involved is incentivized to change the system. Ultimately, what the IT procurement system does best is shovel taxpayer money towards large established vendors and IT consulting firms. And that's what the policy on titled intellectual property arising under Crown procurement contracts calls economic growth and job creation, which is why vendors are supposed to own the IP for software that they create for the government, which is truly astonishing on multiple levels. Producing good software and effective government services is a secondary priority, and that's a major problem. And the effects of that show up years later in the frankly mediocre and unreliable government websites, software, and services that we see across the federal public service today. Follow the rules harder isn't going to work. What does it take instead? It takes a dramatic rethink of how procurement works, a dramatic rethink of how the public service handles tech talent, a dramatic rethink of governance processes, policies, and oversight mechanisms. I can list off a whole series of examples of these if you'd like in our discussion today. Ultimately, though, I'm not confident that the federal public service is internally capable of the kinds of dramatic rethinks that are necessary. It's possible that an external independent review, some future Royal Commission on the Public Service could, and if those bodies were to do their work well, most of their recommendations would involve getting rid of things, getting rid of processes, getting rid of rules, getting rid of all the barriers to doing good work in the public service, to getting feedback and making sure it can get to decision makers, to actually learning and reacting and building things quickly enough for it to matter. Within the federal public service, there are people doing tireless and inspiring work everywhere. I'm really grateful to have worked with many of them. They're held back by outdated processes, old technology, and overly traditional ways of working. And really, in the IT field especially, contractors and consultants don't face the same barriers, even though all those barriers are self-inflicted by the public service on their own staff. And it's easy to be a critic, especially now that I've left the federal public service and I work for a territorial jurisdiction. But ultimately, what I want is for the federal public service to be excellent. It could be so much better, and Canadians in need depend on it. So really happy to chat and looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Boots, and same invitation to you. I hope we'll see you back once the paper is published. Have you both back, as well as the other two people from Carleton who assisted you on that. We look forward to it and sincerely appreciate you taking time to help out OGO and Canadian taxpayers in the end. We'll start with Ms.